this workshop is going to focus on best practices that have emerged for integrating green infrastructure into asset management plans. And we will take a moment in the middle of it to answer some questions. So please go ahead if you have any questions at any point to put them into the chat. All right, so this is our agenda. We're going to start off with an introduction to green infrastructure. We'll spend the bulk of our time discussing best practices in building a state of infrastructure for your green infrastructure assets. So this includes looking at inventories, valuation, age, condition, and risk assessments. We'll look at lots of examples, and then we'll spend some time looking at examples of levels of service. And then if we have time, we'll talk through green infrastructure asset management planning, lifecycle management, and financial strategies. And then finally, we'll finish up looking at a draft green infrastructure asset management maturity spectrum and circle back to some key conclusions that I hope you'll take away from today. All right, to start off, I have a couple poll questions for the group because we're trying to make this a little bit more of a workshop format. So Malik, I'm hoping you could pull up question number 1. And this is a question around green infrastructure itself. So we're wondering how you would rate your current level of knowledge about green infrastructure.
Okay, I've launched the poll, and I'll give people, a couple of seconds to respond. And then Michelle, you can definitely feel free to comment on the findings.
Perfect. So yeah, we'll give you another 15 seconds. We're seeing some results coming in. So a couple people with none, a couple people with advanced, but the bulk of you guys are identifying with either low or medium levels of knowledge about green infrastructure itself. All right, thank you. Okay, and then we have a second poll. So Mark, if you could pull up poll number 2, this question focuses on green infrastructure in asset management planning specifically. So we're wondering, if you're at a municipality, to what extent has your municipality integrated green infrastructure into their asset management planning processes? So the options are not at all, considering it, starting to integrate, and fully integrated. Okay, so we have a couple people with fully integrated, which is fairly consistent with what we know to be true, and then a few starting to integrate, a few considering it, and then a few not at all, which is pretty much what we expected, a wide range of experiences in this topic area. All right, thank you so much, Malik.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing green infrastructure today because there can sometimes be some confusion around the topic and the term, and I want to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page for this workshop. And I thought it might be helpful to walk through some examples. So I've organized these based on how here in Ontario, the Green Infrastructure Ontario Coalition breaks green infrastructure down into different types, because I think it can be helpful to understand the breadth of everything that we're talking about. So first we have our urban tree canopy or our urban forest, and this is really the backbone of our green infrastructure system. So it's street trees, backyard trees, and trees in our forests and parks. And then our network of green infrastructure extends into the natural heritage, the parks, and open space systems. And here again, we have our forests, but then we also add in our wetlands, our meadows, as well as everything from large parks to tiny parkettes and our shorelines. Next, we add in our stormwater systems. So these are sometimes called low impact development, and they include things like bioswales and naturalized stormwater ponds. And then we add our green infrastructure in our buildings. So green roofs, green walls. And then we can also add in our urban agriculture. It's important to not forget about that. So this is the green infrastructure in our community gardens, and maybe we have some green roof agriculture projects in our communities. Now, I did want to mention that we also include technologies that sort of replicate or support the functions of ecosystems as part of green infrastructure. And these are things like permeable pavements or rain barrels, really focused on stormwater management. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we consider soil. to be green infrastructure. And this is because soil is critical for sustaining vegetation and helping manage our water cycles. So without healthy soils in our communities, we cannot have any healthy green infrastructure assets. So given all these infrastructure types I mentioned, it can be useful to think about them as falling into three broad categories. So there's natural infrastructure, which a few different speakers have talked about today. This is things like forests or wetlands. And then there's those engineered solutions like permeable pavement or infiltration trenches. And then we have enhanced or combined solutions. So these are things that really mix nature and engineered. So green roofs and bioswales are examples of these. Now, this is a matrix of all the potential green infrastructure assets that there might be in a municipality. And it essentially summarizes everything I've mentioned so far. So I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I did want to include it in this PowerPoint so that you might have it for future reference in case it is helpful when you start your asset management planning process for green infrastructure. Okay, so this slide has some information on official green infrastructure terminology. So I'll be pretty quick about it, but in Ontario, we do have an official definition for green infrastructure in our provincial policy statement. And it is consistent with what I've talked about here about natural and human-made elements that provide ecological and hydrological benefits. When we go to the federal level in Canada, they tend to use the terms a lot more broadly. So the green infrastructure funding stream will support anything that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, solar panels, wind turbines, alternative energy. They also include water and wastewater facilities. So these are all things that I would not consider to be green infrastructure for the purposes of this presentation. So I just wanted to flag that up front. We're really talking about natural systems or technologies that support natural systems. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with green infrastructure, I'm going to talk briefly about the range of some of the municipal services it can provide. So one of the big ones that we talk about is stormwater management. So our communities have been built by significantly altering the landscape with hard surfaces. So when we integrate conservation of natural areas and integrate green infrastructure, built green infrastructure into the natural form of urban developments, it helps intercept, absorb, and hold stormwater. And this reduces the amount of runoff. Some forms of green infrastructure, including wetlands and naturalized stormwater ponds, can actually lower the chance of urban flooding. They treat rainwater. And then finally, a service which is sometimes forgotten is that green infrastructure can protect riverbanks from erosion. Another service green infrastructure provides is urban heat reduction. So it reduces air temperature through both shading and evapotranspiration, and this can help reduce the urban heat island effect, where urban areas are much warmer than their rural surroundings. So we're talking about climate change today, and green infrastructure, it provides a range of climate change adaptation and mitigation services. Green infrastructure is fairly unique because it contributes to both climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, while it is also vulnerable itself to the impacts of climate change. So it really hits all those boxes. On the mitigation side, it sequesters carbon and its wood biomass, but also reduces energy use through cooling, and it reduces car emissions by encouraging active transportation. And for the adaptation side, we know we've covered the two big areas related to stormwater management and urban heat, but it can also increase the resiliency of our gray infrastructure systems by reducing demand on those built items. But green infrastructure doesn't just contribute to climate change initiatives. So it has many services that extend beyond the climate change envelope. So while yes, it sequesters carbon, we shouldn't forget about the other side of that chemical equation. So trees in our forests produce the oxygen that we breathe. That's incredibly important for us humans. Green infrastructure also has many mental and physical health benefits. It can provide spiritual meaning, and it adds beauty to our communities. Another key point I wanted to make here is that it provides so many services. So with your traditional infrastructure, a pipe, for example, it conveys water. it has one function and it provides 1 to 2 services. And green infrastructure has multiple functions and can provide multiple services, which makes it a very good tool for climate change, but then also makes it a little bit more complicated for asset management. Well, we'll get into that in more detail later today. So now I'm going to transition to our main topic, which is green infrastructure in asset management planning. And in Ontario, we have a regulation that requires municipalities undertake asset management planning, and it states that they should include green infrastructure in these plans. So I imagine most of you are familiar with Ontario Regulation 588.17, and I do apologize for the super wordy slide, but I've included all of the details here from the regulation because we often get asked for it. And I've bolded the most relevant sections. So as you can see in section 5, municipalities shall prepare asset management plans for all other municipal infrastructure assets by July 1st, 2023. And I'm sure most of you know that deadline. But if you go into the definition of all other municipal infrastructure assets, you'll see that green infrastructure is included in that definition. And then the definition of green infrastructure in the reg is also consistent with that of our Ontario provincial policy statement. So it gives very clear direction about including these assets by 2023 in your asset management plans. So one of the first steps of including green infrastructure for asset management planning is to consider what types of green infrastructure does your municipality or your region, what are you responsible for? What do you own or what do you manage? So here I'm going to ask everyone to participate a little bit, and I'm hoping you can go up to the menu at the top of your screen above my slide. There should be a view options or view options option, and then select under there the annotate tool. A little menu bar should pop up, and I'd like you to choose the stamp option and then put a stamp on the green infrastructure assets on the slide that your municipality or maybe the municipality you live in either owns or manages. Okay, we have some stars, we have some check marks, a few hearts. Ooh, one arrow. That's fantastic. All right, so we've had at least a couple municipalities on each of these asset types. So we have quite a few on individual trees, on natural areas like forests, parks and open space, stormwater systems and LID, and maybe a few less on green roofs or urban agriculture. But this really shows the breadth of green infrastructure assets that municipalities have and need to consider as part of their asset management planning process. All right, so I need to go to the next slide, and I need to figure out how to get rid of the annotates here. I'm pretty sure I can clear it. There we go. Okay. Okay, so this slide is a graphic overview of the 4 stages and various components of, oh, thank you. We got one more, of green infrastructure asset management planning. So at the top there in gray, we have that very first step, identifying what green infrastructure are you responsible for, which we talked about on the last slide, and then you work through these stages, which asset managers here will recognize because they're the same you would use for your traditional infrastructure. You start with the state of infrastructure, you then develop levels of service, you do your lifecycle management plan, and then complete your financial strategy. You do all that, you take a breath, and then a couple of years later, you do it all again. So asset management planning is really a process, and it's set up for continued improvement. And this is really important for green infrastructure because you might not have all the data or the perfect methods at this point, but you can start the process and you can improve every time you go through it. So when it comes to green infrastructure, there's quite a few reasons that we've been finding that you benefits green infrastructure and why you want to make sure these assets are included in your asset management plan, whether there's a regulation or not, anywhere in Canada. So these are a few of them. We really want to ensure that green infrastructure assets are valued and considered in decision-making parallel to their traditional infrastructure counterparts. So next to your roads and your pipes, you have your street trees and your forests. We want to manage what we have by undertaking responsible management of green infrastructure assets. So this includes understanding priorities, risks, costs, and management options. And asset management planning is a wonderful process for doing this. We also want to make the case for enhancement. So asset management planning can help support strategic management to increase investment in green infrastructure. Asset management planning can also help a manager develop and defend budgets for green infrastructure maintenance. And then finally, including green infrastructure in your asset management plan can help it become eligible for provincial and federal funding. And that's because these funding streams can often be tied to having an asset management plan in place for these assets. So here, I'm going to ask Malik to pull up poll number 3. So this is where I'm curious, in your opinion, which of these is the most compelling argument for incorporating green infrastructure into asset management plans in your communities? I'll give a little bit more time on this question because I'm asking you to think a little bit. Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, thanks, Malik. All right, so the top option was understanding the priorities, risk, and management options, but we actually saw a fair number of folks enter each of these priorities and reasons. So that's really great. And really I developed these rationales because this is what we've been experiencing with the municipalities that have done this. So we'll start to get into some examples next. All right, so I thought it might be helpful to quickly highlight some of the key differences between traditional and some green infrastructure assets. So Thomas highlighted a couple of these in his great case study. On a fundamental level, traditional assets are purchased and they're constructed, and some green infrastructure assets like forests or wetlands can be naturally forming. They're never purchased. They were there when the municipality was started, right? So next, the vast majority of traditional assets have a clear end of life and will require full replacement. So some green infrastructure assets, again, the forests, the more natural assets, have no definitive end of life and therefore don't necessarily ever need to be fully replaced. The next one is green infrastructure assets can provide a large number of services, and this can make developing levels of service a little trickier, but not impossible. And then finally, when you build a traditional asset, your expected service levels are generally achieved as soon as construction is complete, or maybe once it's operational. Many green infrastructure assets take months or years or even decades to achieve their full expected service levels if they're planted or restored. So it takes time for a tree to grow if you plant a tree. This also means that your asset appreciates in value instead of depreciates in value, which is very different from traditional assets. Now, the slide is here to show you that there are some differences and that there are some challenges, but there also are ways to address all these challenges. And the municipalities I'm going to highlight as best practices today have been at the forefront of doing so. Okay, so now we're going to focus on that first stage of asset management planning where we summarize the state of municipal infrastructure. So in this stage, municipalities are looking to answer the following questions. What green infrastructure assets are you responsible for? How much are they worth? How old are they? What is their condition? And what's the asset's risk or criticality assessment? So first, we're going to look at what assets are you responsible for. So for any green infrastructure assets you're responsible for, the first step of the process will be to build an inventory. And when it comes to building an inventory, there are three main components, just like any asset. You have your asset hierarchy, which is your classification structure. And then you have your asset register, which is the centralized source of asset information. And then finally, you have your asset attributes. So this is what information is collected and tracked for each asset. So all of this combines to inform your state of infrastructure reporting. The inventory and the resulting state of infrastructure really provide a foundation for the decisions and recommendations within the rest of the asset management planning process. So I'm going to run through some examples of best practices where they have been green infrastructure assets have been successfully integrated into asset management plans. This is an example from London, Ontario. So they have their wastewater stormwater service category. They have all the traditional assets like storm sewers, open conveyance. But you can see that arrow that points to their green stormwater infrastructure assets. And so in this case, they've included their bioretention cells and also their dry wells. London also has a whole asset category dedicated to their urban forest assets. So this includes their street trees, their manicured park trees, and their woodlands. This next example is from York Region in Ontario. So this is their corporate asset management plan, where you can see with that arrow that forestry is a category under environmental services. So in this category, they've included street trees, growing medium, planters, and their York Regional Forests. This is an example where they actually have a full standalone green infrastructure asset management plan for their assets. And then the results of that plan, along with all the other plans across the region, get rolled up into this corporate asset management plan. Here's an example from Richmond Hill, so just north of Toronto. They have a category called environmental assets. So in that class, they have street trees and their forested natural areas included in their asset management plan. Here, this is a couple examples from the City of Hamilton State of Infrastructure Report. So they have released the first stage of their updated asset management plan. And like the other examples, they have their forestry assets. So they have their street trees, their urban forests, and the rural forests. They also have their parks included, and I wanted to highlight that here because this is an area where corporately there'll likely be a lot of traditional assets: playgrounds, sports field, benches, garbage cans. Unfortunately, what this means is we often see that the green infrastructure assets of parks get forgotten. So things like park trees, open spaces. It's also important to consider the parks themselves as assets. So in this example, they've done a great job breaking down their parks by size. So from small urban plazas to citywide parks. Many municipalities, through their planning process, speaking to what Christine talked about, you have an existing list of how they break their parks down for management. And this level of detail is really important to transfer over into your asset management plans because it does affect the valuation. And this is because the replacement cost of an urban plaza versus a large citywide natural park is going to be very different. So you need to look at parks as assets and consider them differently based on their size. All right, my final example here is from outside of Ontario. So this one's from the city of Newcastle in Australia. And I think I like to pull this one up because it's interesting because it shows the breadth of green infrastructure assets that can be included in an asset management plan. So they have things that we've seen like street trees and park trees, but they also have their bushland, their creeks, their beaches, their dunes, their wetlands, their coastal cliff lines. They have all of the natural and green infrastructure assets in their community included in their asset management plan. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next inventory question. What are your green infrastructure assets worth? And this is where we talk about asset value. And the purpose of including asset value in your registry is that it provides a measure of what the assets for which your municipality is responsible. And it also gives you an understanding of your level of investment in different assets. So let's look at how asset value can be used. First, it can inform long-term asset management decisions. It can inform financial decisions. It's used for reporting, so both internally and externally, and it allows for comparisons between service areas or asset categories. So this last point is really important, and every time I present on this, I bring this up, because we really need to make sure that green infrastructure assets use the same methods for valuation as traditional infrastructure. So the graphic on this slide shows an example from Ajax, Ontario. And here we have a graph that compares the asset values of all their assets in their asset management plan. So you can see at the top there that they're most significantly invested in road assets, which makes sense. But fifth from the top, we can also see that they have their boulevard trees reported. So we can learn from this graph that they also have a significant amount invested in this green infrastructure asset type, and they need to make sure that they manage this asset type responsibly by including it in their asset management plan. All right, so I'm going to take a step back for a moment for all of us who are not accountants here, because there are a couple of basic concepts that are very important for understanding green infrastructure asset value methodologies. So generally, at a very high level, there are two different valuation approaches in municipal accounting. There's historical cost. So this is the original cost to purchase or construct the asset. And then there's something called current cost, and that's the cost of the asset in today's dollars. This is very simplified, and I apologize to the accountants on the call. But at a fundamental level, it's important to understand the difference between these two things. For asset management planning, the industry best practice and the direction in Ontario within the regulation is to use something called current replacement cost as your asset value. So the current replacement cost is the full cost of replacing an existing asset with a new asset that will provide the current required levels of service in the same operating environment. It also says you need to consider things like technology, construction methods, and materials, and then try and use the least cost option. We can use current replacement cost to determine the value for green infrastructure assets. So it requires two pieces of information. You need to find a benchmark cost and then the quantity of your asset. So for example, the number of trees or the hectares of forest. You can then take the benchmark cost and multiply it by the quantity to get the current replacement cost. Now, for engineered or most enhanced green infrastructure assets, the benchmark costs are fairly straightforward. There's generally a cost associated with constructing a bioswale or planting a tree, and you can use those costs for this calculation. For natural assets, it gets a little bit trickier. And generally, we're finding that restoration cost is the best source of cost. But you have to make sure that you really understand your municipal restoration goals and approaches for these assets. So forests, for example, because there's a large spectrum of appropriate restoration costs within the restoration field. So you really need to be using the cost that most accurately reflects how your municipality would in fact restore that natural asset if it were severely degraded. So the exact method for applying current replacement costs can vary slightly between green infrastructure assets, but at a fundamental level, you're calculating the current replacement cost. And if any of you have heard me speak, you might know that I could probably fill a couple hours on more details about this, and we don't have enough time. But one of the things I talk about more is including how to account for the growth of trees and that service delay. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for you, depending how interesting you find that, I don't have time today, but at the end of this workshop, I will provide some information. You can reach out to me through Chris if you want. I'll also give you some info on a series of webinars that we run that provide a lot more details about green infrastructure asset valuation and really walk you through all the steps in the process. So before we move on from valuation, though, I'm going to take a moment to discuss the two key areas that often cause some confusion. And the first is something called PSAB 3150. And this refers to the Public Sector Accounting Board Handbook, Section 3150 on tangible capital assets. This handbook provides guidance on calculating asset value that determines your tangible capital assets, or your TCAs, in a municipality. And the method that is used for calculating goes back to that historical cost, and it's your historical cost minus the accumulated depreciation of the assets. So PSAB currently restricts the inclusion of what they call inherited natural resources from financial statements. So this means that natural assets like forests cannot be tangible capital assets and therefore cannot be included in municipal financial statements at the moment. Now, as we just learned, asset value for asset management planning should ideally be calculated using current replacement costs, not historical costs. So it's really important to note that assets in an asset management plan do not need to be tangible capital assets or TCAs in order to be included. In fact, best practice is that any asset that has a role in municipal service delivery and that requires deliberate management should be included in an asset management plan. Therefore, PSAB does not pose a barrier to including natural green infrastructure assets like forests in asset management plans. You can do it, and municipalities have done it. You should be doing it. Okay, so then the second area that causes some confusion is around something called natural capital or ecosystem service valuations. So these are used a lot, and I'm an environmental scientist. They're used a lot in my field. I do them a lot at work. And these are ecological economic valuations of the services provided by different green infrastructure assets. But it's really important to note that these are economic valuations and they are not accounting valuations. They should not be used as a valuation for green infrastructure in asset management plans in the state of infrastructure. So it might seem like valuing the ecological services of green infrastructure assets would potentially produce a higher value and therefore benefit green infrastructure in the long run, but that is actually not the case. That is not what we found. To be credible and to be defensible, you need to ensure that we're comparing apples to apples. So traditional infrastructure assets use current replacement costs to value their assets. They do not consider the flood damage avoided from stormwater pipes or the accidents avoided from traffic lights when they're incorporating these assets into their asset management plans. They focus on the cost of replacing the asset itself, and therefore so should green infrastructure. What this means is that you should be focusing on valuing the replacement cost of the biophysical structure through restoration or the planting costs of the green infrastructure assets and not valuing the services they provide. If you do happen to have ecological economic valuations, you can use them in your levels of service discussion. You don't need to have them to develop levels of service, but that's where they are useful in the asset management planning process if you have already done that work. Okay, I am going to take a moment here and pause to see if there are any questions before I move on to the next stages of asset management planning. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris to check.
There's actually some good comments in the chat box around. There are good comments around. One from Milos about PSAB 3150 cannot be used for planning future infrastructure expenditures. That'll result in an overestimate of needs. I wanted to point out a really good resource, and that's the Green Infrastructure Ontario's Municipal Hub, the GEO, and the GEO website. There was a question about does the current replacement cost include the cost of managing, it says managing the waste of the asset being replaced. I think what the question is asking is, does the current replacement cost include the cost of the opportunity cost of replacing the asset, is how I'm interpreting that. I'm not sure that's correct, but
does it mean like decommissioning the asset or sort of removing a dead tree?
Yeah. So for example, if it's a dead tree, does a replacement cost include cutting it down, grinding it, transporting it, composting it, buying a new tree, planting it, and so forth? All of those different steps.
Yeah, so if you go to the Municipal Finance Officers Association guidance on this, it would include all of those steps. Just like for a traditional asset, you would include all of the decommissioning costs in your current replacement costs. Yeah.
Then I'm just gonna suggest people to pay attention to Chad Nelson's what he's posting about different kinds of resources and one of the questions that he's asked in association with that is that FEMA made a change last fall. FEMA in the United States, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US made a change last October to benefit cost requirements that are seen as advantageous to natural infrastructure. Do you think that this would help advance a dialogue in Canada?
So what was the change? Sorry, what did Chad say the change was made through FEMA?
So they made a change last fall to their benefit / their cost benefit requirements that were seen as being advantageous for natural infrastructure. Do you think that what FEMA is proposing could help advance a dialogue in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know all the details of FEMA's proposal, but generally, yes. I mean, cost benefit calculations can be a barrier occasionally to especially low impact development features, which on the green infrastructure spectrum can sometimes cost more, sometimes cost less than traditional infrastructure. I mean, I think the key thing to mention here is that I'm going to reiterate on one of Christine's points is that asset management planning is just one piece of the municipal decision-making puzzle. It's not going to solve all of our issues on the green infrastructure side, and it's not going to solve all of our issues on the planning side. It's a fantastic tool, but it's just one tool in the toolkit. So we really need all of those other policy mechanisms, and maybe this FEMA one is a great one that would work here too. But please know that I'm not saying that this is going to be the answer for all of our natural infrastructure. It's just one piece of the puzzle for sure.
There's a
okay, so sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have time for other questions, or do you want me to hold these to the end?
We'll go back to questions at the end. Yeah, I think we're just gonna pause for a couple questions, give people a break from listening to me talk too much. Okay, so the next topic in the inventory is how old are your assets? So our age attributes really give us an indication of condition and when assets might need to be renewed or replaced. And we're not just talking about age, we're also talking about expected useful life and remaining useful life, which Thomas did a great job illustrating in his example. So here is an example from York Region's Green Infrastructure Asset Management Plan. For urban trees, they have an estimated useful life of 35 years, while for more rural trees on roads, they've estimated 53 years. So this makes sense because we know that urban trees tend to have a much shorter lifespan due to their rougher growing conditions. Here's an example from London showing their expected useful life of their tree assets in green, where they have similarly a shorter lifespan expected for their street trees. They have 25 years compared to 40 years for their park trees. And then the woodlands, they have 100 years. So I'll note here that this is one approach that we're seeing for handling assets like forests or woodlands that don't necessarily have an expected end of life. What we can do within the asset management planning process is assume the maximum lifespan permitted. And that's often 100 years. And this has worked fairly well thus far. We'll also note that the white bar on this graphic shows the average age of the woodlands. And you'll notice that their street and park trees don't have that data here. That's okay. Asset management plans need to be updated quite regularly. So they can add that data in once they have collected it. It's great that they have this here as a placeholder. Okay, from age, we go to the next question, which is, what is the asset's condition? So condition attributes are attributes which reflect the physical condition or deterioration of a green infrastructure asset. As Brian mentioned earlier today, condition is a better measure of remaining useful life than age. But that said, age can be used when condition is not available. Condition is a harder attribute to record. So condition scoring is a very important part of asset management planning for determining when preventative maintenance or capital renewal is required. So condition scoring requires development of a condition rating scale. So this is the same as with traditional infrastructure. It will likely involve creating a rating scale as a way to assess where the asset falls on the scale. Usually a scale will go from beyond end of life, that's generally the worst, to excellent. And it's generally best practice to collect not only the condition score, but also the date of the assessment and your method you use to assess it. So here's an example. This is a condition rating scale of green infrastructure for York Region. So they use this scale of very good to very poor, and this is a standard scale used across all of York Region's assets, gray or green. But with this table, you can see is how they've developed the descriptions using the scale to evaluate their specific asset type. So here we're looking at street trees. A very good condition street tree will be thriving. It will have a well-balanced crown. It will be a perfect specimen. A very poor condition street tree, on the other hand, is expected to die within the next 5 years. Here's a visual example of what I'm talking about, the different conditions of green infrastructure assets. So here we have a shoreline. On the left, there's very little vegetation with lower levels of service related to wildlife habitat aesthetics and safety. Following a major restoration effort, which added stone lookouts, added plants, built a protective boulder shoreline, and removed debris, the shoreline here is in much better condition and provides more services to both human and to wildlife. This is an example of a condition profile for different stormwater assets in London's asset management plans. So the proportion of the stormwater assets in each condition class are shown. Dark green represents very good condition, and I've highlighted the green infrastructure here in red. As you can see, their green infrastructure stormwater assets are in very good condition for the most part, and this is likely because they're very new, especially relative to your stormwater pipe systems. I'll also take a moment to point out here that last bar, there's a significant amount of bright blue. That's the channel assets that have not been assessed yet. And again, showing you that you don't have to have absolutely all the data before you start to include these assets into an asset management plan. Okay, here's one final example from Winnipeg. So this combines condition assessments with valuations to provide some useful insights. So there's a lot of investment in their assets that are in very good condition in the greens here. If a lot of the asset value was reflected in poor or very poor condition assets, so the pink or the red, that would be a really big red flag, indicating a high level of investment will likely be needed soon. So this type of analysis is useful for any type of infrastructure. Because you might have a small number of expensive assets that are a large proportion of the overall value. And if those assets are in poor condition, you really need to know about it and plan for it financially. Okay, so to the last state of infrastructure question, what is the assets risk and criticality assessment? And this is an area where there's still a lot in development in many ways. And I don't think that's actually that unique to green infrastructure. It seems to be the case in a lot of asset management. So I only have one example here. And this is from York Region. They have their standalone green infrastructure asset management plan. So they have delved into risk profiles for their green infrastructure. I don't have all their specific data because that's internal, but this is what they've looked at. For street trees, you see the risks related to ice storms, pests, like emerald ash borer, wind events, and vandalism are assessed. For forests, they have risks related to fire, pests again. And at this point, they use these risk profiles to make some professional judgments about criticality. So they're not yet looking at the consequence of failure, probability of failure, but they are looking at criticality through professional judgment and looking at these different risks. You can also see quite clearly how climate change might impact these risks. You know, we're expecting more storms, we're expecting more pests. That's a lot of the risks that are in these profiles right here, and climate change is going to change how you are looking at your criticality when it comes to these risks. Okay, so now we're going to talk really briefly about the latter stages, stage 2, 3, 4 of asset management planning. The next one is levels of service. So your levels of service is really about measuring the quality, quantity, and reliability of the service from the perspective of the public. So it's important to note that the focus is really trying to be on the community perspective. So metrics are developed to measure performance and targets for both community and municipalities' perspectives. So this is generally referred to as customer and technical levels of service. And a lot of green infrastructure assets really focus on the customer levels of service, which is what we're trying to do with all of our assets. All right, here's an example of levels of service from York Region. So they're assessing whether their streets and landscaping provide the expected benefits to residents. So to assess, they look at both the scope and quality of their street tree assets. So in terms of scope, they are measuring the percent of urban regional roads that meet their landscaping standards. And in terms of quality, they're looking at the percent of street trees meeting satisfactory or better health ratings. And so for both of these measures, they've outlined a target, and then they also have their current performance at the 2016 level. Here is an example from London. So this is also looking at street tree condition and quality ratings. So their target, which isn't actually in this table, but it is to increase all of the measured performance. So they are looking at street trees. They want their street trees to be in acceptable condition and that they meet the same design standards. So these examples are just one sample of the types of services that could be included in green infrastructure when you include them in asset management plans. So levels of service, they take a fair bit of time and thinking to develop and measure, and they will be very specific to your municipality. And as we've seen in these examples, they can also rely very significantly on condition information from the State of Infrastructure report. But when you get into green infrastructure, this is still an evolving field because there are so many different services you can be looking at. So you really need to think, as a municipality, we're planting these street trees. Why are we planting them? What is the purpose? Is it around biodiversity? Is it around shade to protect from UV rays? Is it around mental health benefits? You know, the list is fairly endless. So you need to figure out what you're focusing on for your asset management plan and what the fundamental reason is that you plant or grow these assets in your municipality to develop your levels of service. Okay, so we're going to move on and finish with some very quick notes on the last two stages of asset management planning, lifecycle management and financial strategies. Really, once you've done your state of infrastructure and your levels of service, these stages don't differ too much between green infrastructure and traditional assets. So your asset management lifecycle strategy is developing a set of planned lifecycle actions that will enable the assets to provide the desired levels of service. So in this stage, as most of you probably know, you examine different lifecycle management options. So things like maintenance, operations, rehab, replacement, disposal, and growth or service improvements. For green infrastructure, this can include things like extending the number of years newly planted trees are watered to ensure that they survive those early critical years. Or maybe your transportation projects result in street tree plantings that you'll have to maintain, but it's not under your control how many are planted. And therefore you need to plan for this expansion expense. Your goal is really to determine the ideal set of activities that will achieve the ideal condition profile and maintain the levels of service required. And then of course you also need to look at the costs involved. Here again is an example from York Region. So for their street trees, their rehab activities have been identified as things that will extend the lives of their mature and veteran trees. Things like root barriers, propping, and cabling. The replacement activities they've identified include planting trees, which makes sense from an urban forestry perspective, but then also using technologies like soil cells to plant with their trees under sidewalks to protect root zones from compaction. Okay, so the last stage, the financial strategy. An asset management financial strategy outlines the suggested approach to funding the lifecycle management plan as outlined in the previous stage. So here you identify your funding sources available from different types of management activities. This is also where you look at expenditure forecasting and determine the funding and potentially the infrastructure gap. So the infrastructure gap is the gap between the optimal budget versus the planned available funding. And a lack of funding can result in insufficient investment, can affect levels of service, it can create higher risk of failure, and can also result in a cyclical higher life cycle cost, which is very frustrating. This stage really provides the foundation of long-term financial plans. It can help you defend and rationalize your budget, getting back to those points of including green infrastructure in this process. It really gives you detailed financial metrics to defend your budgets. It can also influence financial priorities. Things like the use of debt or creating a reserve or using reserve funds can be rationalized through this process. And as I mentioned, at this point, it really doesn't differ that much between traditional assets and green infrastructure assets. This is an example from London's urban forest. So they're forecasting showing the required investments in the blue bars, the existing planned budget in the red, and then the cumulative expected infrastructure gap due to these funding shortfalls is the green line. So there will likely be an infrastructure gap for all assets, including green infrastructure assets. But this process really helps municipalities make decisions about where to direct funding to close those gaps. And hopefully, one of the goals of asset management planning is that someday these gaps will be reduced, right? Okay, so this is my second to last slide. I know we're all getting hungry. So I've thrown a lot of information at you guys today. And so to try and help make some sense of where municipalities are at with respect to green infrastructure asset management, I put together a draft maturity spectrum. So I'll spend a couple minutes walking through it, but I'll just focus on a few key pieces from each level, but this will be available in the PowerPoint slide in more detail. So we can start with municipalities that are unaware. So this is where organizations have not recognized the need for green infrastructure asset management, or perhaps are unaware of the need or the regulation here in Ontario. The next level is aware. So basic asset information is recorded on some green infrastructure assets, but it's generally in a combination of sources and formats. So often this information is collected for other purposes. Maybe your urban forest management plan, maybe your planning, your design, your maintenance, your inspections, rather than specifically for asset management. And this can really often be the case for green infrastructure. There might be some green infrastructure asset data somewhere on your municipality that was collected not for the purposes of asset management planning, but that you can use in asset management planning. The next step on the spectrum is beginner. So you have your basic asset information recorded on green infrastructure assets in an asset registry that really enables you to start hierarchically reporting through asset management planning. We then move on to intermediate, where green infrastructure is included in an asset management policy or strategy, or maybe you have at least one green infrastructure asset included in your corporate asset management plan. And then for advanced, I'm going to go through all of them just to give a sense of what the eventual goal should be. So 1, all of your green infrastructure assets are included in your asset management plan. 2, detailed information is recorded on all green infrastructure assets in an asset register. 3, you have a detailed green infrastructure risk and criticality assessment that are based on probability and consequence of failure. And 4, you have a life cycle strategy that outlines actions based on the total cost of the green infrastructure assets throughout their life. So as we near the end of the session today, I'm wondering where you might rank your municipalities on this spectrum. So if you can take a minute to open up the annotate tool again at the top under options, there's annotate. I'm wondering if you could put a stamp, if you're comfortable, on the level that most closely applies to your municipality. And then also, I mentioned that this is a working draft. So if you have any general comments, suggestions, feedback, I'd be incredibly interested to hear it. So please don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and then I'll ask Chris or Malik to record those at the end, and I will integrate them into the spectrum. Okay, great. So we're seeing folks all along the spectrum. One or two advanced, a lot in aware or beginner, intermediate, a couple in unaware. Okay, well, thank you for those of you who are willing to do that. I really appreciate that. Okay, all right, so I know we're running out of time today, so I'm going to clear this. And go to my very last slide here. Okay, so as I wrap up today, I want to circle back to some of the few key conclusions I'm really hoping you walk away from this workshop with. The first is green infrastructure assets need to be included in asset management plans by July 1st, 2023 in Ontario. Assets do not need to be tangible capital assets or TCAs to be included in an asset management plan. Asset valuation should be calculated using current replacement costs for green infrastructure assets. There are differences between green infrastructure and traditional infrastructure assets, but there are strategies for addressing those differences for asset management planning. And then finally, I know I've made this point a lot, but all the data is not required before you start to integrate green infrastructure assets into asset management plans. Okay, so we're going to open it up again for questions. Thank you all so much for being here today. I did want to quickly mention that if you are dying for more details or technical information, there is a webinar series I mentioned that I teach through the Green Infrastructure Ontario Coalition. So you can go to their website, which I put up here, or you can email that email address and they will let you know when we release the 2021 dates.